Hello everyone and welcome to Profane Egyptologists, the show where we discuss Egypt's past in the present. Today I'm joined by my friend, the award-winning filmmaker Chris Kemble, as we discuss 2017's remake of the Universal film The Mummy. This is part 2 of a 2-part episode, so do be sure to check out both. As a specialist in the horror genre, Chris is uniquely positioned to give insight into this film. And as a non-Egyptologist, he asks many questions I might not consider. And we go a bit further into the franchise and the legacy of mummy movies and literature. I hope you enjoy this format. Feel free to send me feedback on Twitter, and please, if you like the show, subscribe on iTunes and rate and review, as that really helps us spread the word and raise the show's profile. Now, buckle up for our Halloween specials as we explore the world of The Mummy. I want to talk about Amenet a little bit and get into that, because she's... Well, I was going to say she's the first female mummy, but she's not the first female mummy, because there are a couple in literature which kind of set the precedent for it. The first being the one I mentioned in the last episode, Rider Haggard, famous for writing King Solomon's Mines, also wrote a story called She, which is where the She Who Must Be Obeyed comes from. And she is an immortal from ancient times who's waiting for her reincarnated lover to kind of fall back under her spell. And it is weird because it sets the precedent for a lot of the literary devices that mummy literature would use for a while, and several authors would lean on when it came to writing their mummy stories, such as the reincarnated lover, the eternal life being a quote-unquote curse, and then this all gets kind of mixed up in the curse narrative.
Well, yeah, so I was wondering from you in terms of ancient Egypt and historical fact, how much of a precedent kind of there was for a character such as her prior to becoming the mummy, that kind of strong princess, potential to kind of rule in father's stead and that kind of thing. Yeah.
No, that's a good question, actually, because women in ancient Egypt had quite different roles to, say, what we understand of the role of women in ancient Greece. So women in ancient Egypt had more rights. They could do things like own land, appeal for divorce. At different periods, obviously, the law kind of comes and goes and changes, and our understanding of it is limited by access to records. But there was a precedent within royal families for women to hold power, and there is a theory that royal blood, the line of succession, actually went through the woman, the queen. So if you wanted to become pharaoh and you weren't born of the pharaoh, if you wanted to legitimate your rule and say you were of non-royal blood, so say you were of the military and the pharaoh is dead and you want to step into power, to legitimate that rule, you would marry whatever royal blooded female you could.
Okay.
Be that the pharaoh's daughter, sometimes the pharaoh's sister or niece, or you would marry into the royal blood through the woman.
What would happen with the queen? So if the pharaoh died, then his wife...
It seems like in ancient Egypt, if the pharaoh died and there was a son, then the son would become the pharaoh. Now, sometimes if the son was too young, there would be a co-regency. So that's what happened in some circumstance. Otherwise, you get like these unusual things, like with the reign of Thutmose III. So when Thutmose II died, his great queen became pharaoh. She was a co-regent with his son Thutmose III, but his son was very young. And then for a while, Thutmose III seems to kind of disappear from the records for a bit. Some people have theorized he was maybe off with the military, or maybe, kind of traveling and learning about military life and Egyptian civilization and politics, etc. But Hatshepsut becomes, for all intents and purposes, the pharaoh, the king. So here we have a woman ruling exclusively on her own, and very successfully. It was a fairly prosperous time in Egypt's history. Yeah, she ruled as a king, represented herself as a king, and ruled on her own, except for this kind of notion of having a co-regent. It seems like the Egyptians were much more accepting of a queen in power than perhaps, say, the Greeks might have been. The Greeks wouldn't have ever had just a queen in power, really. That would be quite rare. The only instance we have of that is still in Egypt with Cleopatra and Berenice, however you want to say that. So these were actually Macedonian Greek royals who came over to Egypt and were established in Alexandria after Alexander the Great. And that's when you had Greek queens able to rule on their own. But again, it's in Egypt. This seems to be, there's a precedent for this. And there are some instances in the historical record where we do seem to see perhaps hints of female rulers in place holding power. But yeah, there are a few examples of it in the historical record of queens ruling Egypt by themselves. So there is historical precedent for a character like Amunet to assume that she would assume the throne, so to speak. It's not the most common version of that role dynamic, but it's certainly a possible version of that role dynamic. So historically, yeah, there's, and it seems like Amunet may be kind of based on a very liberal interpretation of the story of Hatshepsut, because what happened was after Thutmose III took the throne, it was actually several years after he took the throne. It doesn't seem like necessarily this was done out of anger. It seems like this was done because the Egyptian way of doing things needed to be restored. He needed to wipe the name of Hatshepsut from the record in order to continue the succession of kings that he was a part of. So he did that. But it seems like there's evidence to suggest that it was quite a few years before he actually did that. So it's not like he got into power and wiped her out of history because she'd committed this great transgression. It was more like he acknowledged eventually that actually, I need to kind of reestablish the line of the pharaoh king lists, as is in line with Egyptian tradition. And they were very conservative, very traditional people when it came to the royal line of succession. So even though it was possible for a queen to hold court and hold power, ultimately there would always be a kind of conservative force pushing for that traditional line of Egyptian kings to be re-established, in order that Ma'at is re-established. So it's an interesting and fairly complex thing, this conception of Egyptian royalty. But there's precedent for it in historical fiction as well. So we were talking a little bit last episode about how there had been several mummy stories in literature before they were ever put in film. And we spoke about, the Sherlock Holmes' author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, producing 2 stories with the Ring of Thoth and lot number 420-something. And the number's gone now. And so another story from another writer of that period is Bram Stoker of Dracula fame. And he wrote what would have been one of the first full-length mummy novels in a format that we would recognize in modern cinematic terms. And in his Jewel of Seven Stars, we have an Egyptian queen being brought into the modern world. She takes on an identity which is closer to a real person, closer to Karloff's model of the mummy, where she looks like a person rather than looking like a shambling mound of bandages, And then, it kind of interacts with people, and there's reincarnation, and there's, murders, and there's all the kind of staple things that we've come to understand of Egyptian mummy cinema kind of things. And that was turned into a film called Blood from the Mummy's Tomb.
Hammer
film. Yeah. Exactly. 1971.
Yeah.
So that's part of an illustrious line of Hammer mummy movies or Hammer monster movies.
Well, yeah, and it tends to be it's an interesting choice because it tends to be the Hammer, Christopher Lee kind of mummy movies where this shambling, bandaged monster is more prevalent as opposed to Karloff's one. And it's interesting with Bram Stoker bringing that in because it is quite a gothic, certainly in this film, this kind of gothic horror where it kind of generates. And it's interesting to see bringing the exotic into the gothic, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where that kind of Orientalist notion meets the gothic tropes. And it's also, in Stoker's story, we see the expansion on, and this is an idea that did exist in a few short stories before it, the expansion of the idea, which was kind of the original idea of the mummy, actually, as a revived princess and an object of desire of modern Western males. And in Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, we see Valerie Leon's character, Queen Tara, as a form of seductress. And this is a theme that I think we see continued somewhat with Sofia Boutella's mummy, who, is I think it's fair to say, subject to the male gaze, if we're looking at it in cinematic terms.
Yeah, well, they certainly kind of play up a love angle. Well, not love angle, but like kind of between... Desire, that's the word I was looking for. Between Boutella, but then also Dr. Halsey for him as well. There's this kind of love triangle, for want of a better word.
A love pyramid, some would say.
Oh, there you go. But then it falls somewhat flat for me because there's no real need for it. There is no... I mean, is she set to marry? Set? Like, is it kind of, what is the point of it? Like, that's what never kind of didn't ring true somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. It felt very contrived to me. In fact, every one of those relationships felt contrived to me. And not that there was anything lacking from Sofia Boutella's performance, because I thought her performance was incredibly strong, actually.
Well, it certainly, when she's tied up, he seems to feel bad for her, even though we've established already that she's a monster. She's killed people. She's trying to kill him. Although she's not trying to kill him, she's trying to empower him. But there is the misleading imagery of her being kind of bound, therefore a victim of sorts of prodigium and things like that, when clearly she is not. She is the monster that they are contained. And you could argue that would not necessarily be quite so striking if it was a big, lumbering, kind of monstrous figure.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it does evoke our sympathy for her character, where she's bound by this kind of semi-faceless organization. I mean, Russell Crowe is the face of the organization, but I think that brings us really nicely, actually, into the next part of the film, because this is where we get, she's captured during the encounter at the church, or just after the encounter at the church between, Tom Cruise's character and Amunet. So Amunet is about to kill him, and she knows exactly where the dagger is in this reliquary. And then she smashes this reliquary, gets the dagger out. She's about to kill Tom Cruise, realizes that the stone is missing, and this kind of stops her hand. The ruby gem that's supposed to sit in the hilt is missing from the dagger, so presumably the ritual won't be complete if she kills him now.
Yeah, I mean, this was a section I was not quite sure about. How did they know? How did the kind of medieval British know that they needed the dagger and the stone, or at least to separate the two?
It's all very tenuous, isn't it? I mean,
if she's been mummified for so long, she's been entombed for so long, how do they know that this is going to do anything, that it's so important as to keep?
Yeah, absolutely. And her name has been stricken from history, and yet this Egyptologist, in the pub just before they go to that church, is saying, we believe there was an Egyptian princess who was struck from history, and I don't really understand how they've gotten to this point if this was actually struck from history, because there wouldn't be any record of it.
Although, what about Hatshepsut?
Arguably, Hatshepsut was struck from history, and we still know about her. That's true. But then I guess we found she left temples. She left, even though her name was removed from a lot of that stuff, we found enough evidence surrounding her life and death to confirm her identity. Whereas, and that's actually a very good question.
Again, I mean, I don't know in terms of she ruled for a certain period of time. So then, unless the records were changed to fill that gap.
I guess the difference is that Hatshepsut did rule for a significant period of Egyptian history and left her mark on it, whereas Princess Amenhotep, we're led to believe, is robbed of the opportunity to do that, and so arguably hasn't left her mark on history. And if she's then also been struck from history, how is there anything for any of these characters to go on in the first place? But I get it's a niggle. It's just a niggle, and I don't want to get caught up on it.
No, you have to take that with a pinch of salt. And just go with it. Was there precedent for kind of crusaders in ancient Egypt finding Egyptian relics and things like that?
There's some, and I want to be really careful about how I put this, because I don't want to fan the flames of the Illuminati conspiracists, what have you. Yeah, and the Templar thing. But
well, that's what this movie is doing. That was my implication, was that they were some kind of you see a group of crusaders.
Yeah, absolutely. It is doing that to a certain degree. It is. There is some precedent for it in the historical record, in that the Rosicrucians, who are, said to have been born out of the bosom of the Templars, were very interested in ancient Egyptian culture and religion and quote-unquote mysticism. And the Rosicrucians eventually become, and I use that term loosely, the Freemasons. Mm-hmm. And so we do have kind of a line of succession to Templars and Crusaders, very loosely speaking. Although,
I mean, I've played Assassin's Creed Origins. I get the I get the timeline.
I haven't played it myself. I'd like to. And if anyone from Ubisoft wants to send me a copy, then they're very welcome to do so.
That would be a hell of a podcast.
Yeah, it would. Just me sitting playing that game for about 50 hours. So yeah, I suppose there is some precedent for that. I personally don't think one shouldn't have to look outside of the film to historical precedent to find the reasons for these people looking for this stuff. It's not explained in film, I think, is my problem with it. It's not very well explained how they go about it, but it doesn't really matter in the context of a movie which takes as many liberties as this. And I don't think that historical accuracy is the problem here. I think that just watertight storytelling is more the issue, with that particular part.
Well, there is a certain angle of a kind of convenient narrative, but then also, for me, I find it raises more questions than it needs to. It could have all been set in Egypt. Why come to England at all? What narratively is the importance of that?
Yeah.
I think we touched on this before, but it's a mummy movie that's hardly in Egypt, if at all, really, because it starts in Iraq and it moves to England.
In fact, it's arguably, the film itself is never in Egypt. You only see Egypt in flashback. So we're never really there.
But I don't know why.
No, I don't know why either. And I think it maybe says something interesting about the perception of Egypt and Britain's connection, given that Britain was the window, Britain and France in particular were the window through which later conceptions of Egypt and Egyptology were built. There was the Napoleonic expedition, which happened at the end of the 18th century, when the British went in to secure access to the passage to India. They knew they had to defeat the French in order to do that, and they did it in Egypt. That's where basically Napoleon chose to have that battle. Because of that, I think there is this constructed relationship between Egypt and Great Britain. We learn about Egypt at primary school here. It's been a key part of the syllabus for a long, long time. Every school kid in England has probably been to the British Museum, has heard stories about excavations, and with respect to Egyptology, Britain is, very closely tied to some of the biggest discoveries.
in movies, the first Karloff movie is all about the British kind of excavations.
Yes.
And in fact, there's a weird, the movie's not aged very well, moment of kind of British colonialism, of them being infuriated that the Egyptians, they're having to do it all through the Egyptian Museum, the Museum of Cairo, as opposed to, we're British, we know what we're doing, we should be dealing with this.
It's funny how these old attitudes are revealed by these things, isn't it? But yeah, I think there's definitely precedent for Britain to be part of that story, right or wrong. But it doesn't really, again, we don't get a sense of that in particular here. I think that it's set in Britain in this movie universe so that they can establish Dr. Jekyll and Prodigium rather than anything else. And that's part of the problem of this film, I think, it's establishing that stuff rather than...
Well, that's the thing, I think. But the thing is, they could have established him as a character anywhere in the world, really.
Yeah, they could.
I think, and again, not to harp on about it, but really introducing those characters should have been at the end as almost like a post-credit sequence.
Yep.
We
could have had our Nick Fury scene.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But flip side, gothic horror side of it, and that's something that I think this movie is pushing. And beyond that, then the Dark Universe itself, going for the more horror, but then specifically kind of gothic horror. You do see that in this film, and it is very tied in with kind of English history and the cobbled streets. And although I think, we were talking about how it's very anachronistic to have this pub with cobbled streets and gaslight, but it is very gothic. And in some respects, you could argue that then works figuratively within the film.
Yeah.
Again, tying it back to Bram Stoker and that kind of period.
Well, absolutely. And I think in that context, it makes sense.
It just didn't really come across like that. I didn't watch it and go, oh, it's gothic. Nice touch there. I was left feeling like, that doesn't look like an English pub a street I've ever seen.
Well, it was a lot emptier than most English pubs I've seen on any night. But that does bring me onto another point, though, and that's that the Dr. Jekyll, to me, feels out of place in two ways. Both kind of thematically, because this is a mummy movie that's now being pulled in a different direction, but also chronologically, because you've raised a good point, I think, about the idea of Gothic London and the notion of this kind of anachronism not really sitting very well in modern London itself. To me, the moment I saw Russell Crowe playing Dr. Jekyll, my brain went, irrespective of the surroundings and what I'd already seen, my brain went, oh, we're in Victorian London. And when he talks about being a physician in addition to a lawyer, I found my brain going, oh, what kind of thing would that have been back then? Rather than, oh, how does that work now? I literally felt he was a walking anachronism in the sense that he didn't fit in the modern world.
Well, his language and behaviour, does anyone refer to themselves as a physician as opposed to doctor? Or perhaps they do, and I'm an idiot. Almost certainly that. But I did feel anachronistic, certainly, but also not particularly true to his character either, as it was in the books. He's a doctor, but why is he investigating mythical beings?
Again, it's quite tenuous, isn't it?
Yeah. And they never explained that either.
No, they didn't.
I assume it's because of his turning into Mr. Hyde. It gives him a unique kind of insight, perhaps.
Possibly. I do wonder why they didn't go the whole hog and just have Van Helsing.
That would have been a better bet.
I just don't understand why I understand that we're probably going to get in fact, we are supposed to be getting a Jekyll and Hyde origin movie, right? That is a thing, isn't it?
I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I heard it was a thing. I don't know if it's still a thing. There's a lot of crosstalk about whether the Dark Universe is still actually happening or not. There was a recent tweet by an artist who's working on one of the films to suggest it is still happening. And that we are going to get Bride of Frankenstein next with Angelina Jolie potentially. That's the rumor.
I find it interesting that they that they're choosing Bride of Frankenstein as their follow-up, so presumably establishing a monster that's already present.
Mm.
And what I think will be interesting will be whether or not they go with that more lumbering creature from the movies, or whether or not they're going to take the character more from the book.
Is this Bride of Frankenstein or Frankenstein?
Sorry,
Frankenstein's monster, I mean. Bride of Frankenstein or
monster.
Frankenstein's monster?
Frankenstein's monster. Whether they're going to take him as the lumbering Karloff creature that he was in their previous movies, or whether or not they'll take him more from the kind of the book and he's kind of a more lost thinking.
Let me go out on a limb here. I think one of the core themes, and we're seeing it in this movie as well, but of this franchise, is the idea of it taking a monster to fight a monster. And
Yes.
I suspect the reason that Tom Cruise has been set up as this superhero set mummy god demon guy, he doesn't know what he is. How the hell should we? The reason he's been set up this way is presumably because they're going to have a super team of not bad monsters fighting bad monsters. And Frankenstein's monster is probably one of the monsters. Angelina Jolie is a name and therefore will be a quote-unquote hero or anti-hero in the same vein as Tom Cruise.
Javier Bardem is set to play the monster.
Interesting.
Javier Bardem's good casting, I think. It leads me to believe that they would be making him that more kind of thinking creature, and I think he could do. Yeah, I think, but also he's a big guy. He's physically imposing. I think he can be very menacing, as we've seen in his previous films, menacing in a very understated way.
Mm-hmm.
I think the casting of that is unlike some of the others, maybe, or it fills me with intrigue as to what they're going to do with it.
Yeah. And I mean, Jolie herself is an interesting choice as well. I can see her in that beehive without question.
It'll be interesting to see if they do try and tie Tom Cruise into it. It would make sense, or whether or not. But that's the thing. If you're going to have that, like, is Jekyll and Hyde are they not meant to be the thing that ties them together? Or?
Pulling it back to Amunet, we have her captured by a prodigium and bound, and we have this kind of artificial sense of sympathy for her being, at the mercy of this semi-faceless organization, which is already headed up by someone of quite questionable character, Ray Winston on a bad day when he turns into Mr. Hyde. One thing I found really interesting as an Egyptologist, and just going back to that angle for a second, is that Dr. Jennifer Halsey, is it? Takes the opportunity. She's got someone here who's lived in ancient Egypt, and I think this is every Egyptologist's dream, so to speak, to actually have a conversation with someone who was there and be able to get their take on ancient Egypt. And I'm glad that they took the opportunity to do it. I'm sad that she gets scared off with one threat. I would have imagined her professional curiosity would have made her a bit more invested in getting more out of Sophia Botella's Amunet character. But she questions her and she says, I've studied the ways or the language of the old gods, and, Amunet quite rightly scoffs at the idea that these are old gods because they're still very relevant to her, and she's in fact bringing one into the world as we speak. One thing that did strike as a bit of a clangor to me was when the mummy starts speaking English and says, your language is simple. Now, I don't know about you, but I think English has been called one of the most complex languages in the world for a good reason. It's certainly not the most complex, but it's a composite of several languages, and much more complex than ancient Egyptian in a lot of ways.
And hieroglyphics.
Don't get me started on hieroglyphics again. Oh, it's baiting me now. Hieroglyphs, yes. It's only the written form anyway. We just call it Egyptian as far as the language is concerned. They speak reasonably proficient ancient Egyptian language in this movie, unlike my English. And it's interesting to note that, they come up with this idea that English, because it's what less mysterious is somehow simpler. That's a funny notion, I think.
Yeah.
And then we have chaos breaks out, and Hyde and Cruz have their arbitrary fight, which would have been completely avoidable if Mr. Hyde, or rather Dr. Jekyll, just had a stopwatch, an alarm, Alexa reminder, take your shot, Dr. Jekyll. It seems kind of silly to always leave it to beyond the last minute to me. What's that about?
Yeah. Again, I mean...
Stupid.
Well, just nitpicking.
It's weak. It's weak storytelling.
It's
a weak device.
Simple story. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But anyway, that's just one of my bugbears. Now, another thing I want to get into, though. When that chaos breaks out, the original Golden Book of Amun-Ra, I believe it is, from the 1999 Stephen Sommers Mummy movie, is pictured falling off a shelf. That book exists in that universe. Now, I realise that this is supposed to be just an Easter egg nod that no one really puts too much thought into. But doesn't this imply that this is actually happening in the same universe as the original Mummy movies? And if that's the case, isn't Imhotep out there, buried out there somewhere? And the Scorpion King. Yeah. And O'Connell and Evie probably are now mummified as well.
Maybe they set up Prodigium.
Oh, man. I would get reinvested. I would be so more invested if this came full circle and it had been, they had a period flashback of O'Connell and Evie setting up Prodigium. That would be amazing. And also discovering the tomb of Amunet and leaving it and being like, there's this thing here, guys. You're going to have to deal with this when technologies come a bit further. I
mean, maybe in the sequel they'll need Amunet to fight Imhotep, and it'll be...
That's where you go with this. We've just solved the Dark Universe, Chris.
You're welcome, guys. What I didn't get, and I think we spoke about this before, but is what was Prodigium's plan? They've spent all this time trying to find this mummy.
Yep.
But they don't want to wake her up, so why try and find her in the first place? Or if they didn't know, how did they know about the curse? Did they know about the curse?
I get the impression that Russell Crowe knows about the curse.
Yeah, like how? But then also, what is their? Are they trying to harness the power of the mummy?
Okay, so my take on it is that Russell Crowe's Dr. Jekyll knows about the curse, seems to know every detail of the curse, wants to summon Set, quote-unquote, evil, the god of evil, as they've mislabeled him, into human form so he can kill him.
But why? He's not there.
Okay,
he's only there to kill him once you've summoned him. So
yes.
Just don't summon him.
Yeah, but, again, and I may be overreaching what they were implying, but when he has that initial... There's an awful lot of exposition in this movie, but when he has like the 5th or 6th exposition conversation with Tom Cruise in his office, he's implying, or at least my reading of it, he's implying that Set, this god of evil, might be somehow the source of evil, and therefore if they can get it in human form, that will kill evil. And maybe, I'm guessing from that, and this is a bit of a leap, but maybe that cures him of his condition as well.
Right. Okay. I can get behind that idea. I mean,
that's my reading of it. It wasn't very well explained, but that is my reading of his motivation there. For a film with so much exposition, there is an awful lot between the lines that doesn't get said.
Well, that's the thing. There seems to be a lot of exposition, but about kind of the wrong things, or at least the questions that you don't really need. No one's asking.
Yeah.
So there's a lot about Prodigium and why they're there, but no one wants to know about them. It's why, if she's got all these powers, is the mummy trying to bring Set back? He's already given her powers. She's got these powers. Good for her. So if there was something tied into that narrative of, if she doesn't do it, she'll be cursed forever, even though she already is, or she'll lose those powers or something. There's never really explained any motivation, because it doesn't seem to be she's in love with him set.
No.
Perhaps. I mean, she is choosing people she seems to be attracted to, but I just assumed that was because, if you're going to make anyone a god, it may as well be someone you like. It's all questions that are not asked, not answered, and I'm asking them. But, it's just all distraction.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it does kind of reveal just how clunky some of these, when you look at the motivations of the characters, it reveals just how clunky and ham-fisted some of the story devices are, because I feel like she's arbitrarily attracted to Tom Cruise's character because the script says so. I feel like characters are making decisions and things are happening because reasons, rather than they naturally flowing from one scene to the next. And again, I think coming back to your point in the last episode of there being something lost in translation between multiple iterations of scripts and the actual process of filmmaking itself. And we have a studio that's invested in setting up a dark universe, which is perhaps at odds with the main thrust of the story of, one narrative in the film. All these things that got left out, all these things, the story elements that were left on the cutting room floor, who knows? We could be kind and assume they filled in some of these blanks.
Well, I mean, in the Stephen Sommers movie, Imhotep is drawn to Evie.
Mm.
And it is explained why, but I cannot remember why. But I don't believe is she meant to have Egyptian lineage? Is she meant to be...
She does have Egyptian lineage when she's... God, I know that movie inside out. When she's telling O'Connell her backstory when they're all on site, and he's saying, him I get, you I don't get. She says it's because, my father fell in love with my mother who was Egyptian, and he was Egyptologist, and Egypt's in her blood. And she literally, I think, puts it that way. Okay.
So that in itself is a much more... It's a very throwaway thing that explains a lot of narrative, you could argue, following from the mother's bloodline, kind of bit of Egyptian historical kind of accuracy.
Imhotep, when he first sees her, has bad eyesight because he's stolen the eyes from the guy who has terrible eyesight. And so when he first comes back, he just sees this woman, this kind of beautiful outline of a woman in front of him, and says, Anaxonomon. And I've watched that movie way too many times, and we're led to believe that he's mistaken. He believes initially that he's just attaching the notion of Anaxonomon to her. That over the course of the movie becomes his obsession to reincarnate, rejuvenate, bring her spirit into Evie's body, which is in a reversal of, what's happening in this film.
Well, that's the thing, and it's much more in line with the Karloff movie. His whole motivation is basically doing it to bring his lover back, whereas it's not really established in the same way in this movie, which is interesting. They're taking it in a different direction, but then it feels muddled. Yeah, because it's neither one thing nor the other.
Yeah, absolutely.
He seems to just be the first person there.
Yep.
So he's chosen.
Yep.
And then she's kind of stuck with him, but then,
I think script rewrites and certain demands are probably...
It's a shame. I think it makes the whole movie a missed opportunity, I think. But I think a lot of the problems that I have with it are... They're problems that you notice on when you stop and think about it.
Yeah.
They don't necessarily ruin the enjoyment of like a roller coaster action adventure film that's different from the others, and kind of fine, we're applauding something that's different from the others and they're trying something new with the Dark Universe. But it is a problem when you're like, yeah, I really like this bit, but actually, why are they doing any of this?
Again, I didn't hate the film. I didn't hate it. but it doesn't stand up to analysis very well. And it's not to say that any of them need to stand up to, again, it's not about accuracy, because I think that's a fool's errand when it comes to this kind of film. It's not about historical accuracy. It's about making a solid story based on historically inspired sources. How does this fit in to the legacy, shall we call it, of mummy movies and mummy literature? That's a more interesting question to me, rather than, how does this compare to historical records? Because that's a pointless question.
I feel like this film will, if the producers have any control, they'll try and bury it away and forget it never happened and scrub it from the history books. And
do you think it will face the fate of Amunet?
Yeah. Essentially, it's already proven that, with the Dark Universe kind of being seemingly on hold because of terrible reception. And it's a shame they had such a great opportunity. But it's hard to... I know firsthand about how things can just spiral out of control and get lost by the wayside. So
yeah,
movies are difficult to make. It's a simple fact. And so a lot of the times you can't see the wood for the trees, and things fall by the wayside, things that make sense because of ideas you had before. And then by the time the final cut comes along, you've lost a lot of that. So now you are left with questions that you as the filmmaker might already know the answer to and assume they're there, but your audience just don't get.
Absolutely. And it's a really important point, again, to note that the film is not the triumph or failure of any single person. It's, it's a lot of the time these things lay with the feet of the director, and I feel that's especially unfair given how much control the director doesn't have over the end product.
No. And certainly in big franchises as well.
Yeah.
There's so much at stake, kind of money, kind of with the franchise, where it's going to go, and things like that. Especially with the first one, you're not making one movie. You're trying to lay the groundwork for however many to come.
Yeah. Well, I think for all of its failings and inconsistencies, this film still adds something to the canon of mummy movies. It adds a different twist. It adds a very interesting mummy. She may not be as sympathetic in a straight-up kind of way that the original Imhotep was. She may not even be as sympathetic as the Imhotep of the Stephen Sommers movies. She's not the shambling monster of the Caris the Mummy character. So it's an interesting take in the sense that it's new and it's trying to do something different, like you say.
It's a film that's at odds with itself. It's got a lot of good things going for it. Those you mentioned, I like Tom Cruise's character, but it has a lot of small things that kind of build up and fight against the good things. There aren't kind of big, massive issues. They're just a lot of small ones that then add up to make big issues.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summation. Well, thank you for joining me to talk about what is the Mummy movie and the establishment of the Dark Universe. I'd be interested to see what happens next and what form future Mummy movies will take if the Dark Universe doesn't pan out.
Yeah, I'd hope there would be more. I find it interesting that there aren't more, really. Like you had the kind of Universal monster movies, but then you had Hammer making their own.
Yeah.
And Universal don't own Egyptian legacy, so
yeah. And that's a good question, and it may lead us into some interesting areas to talk about with respect to Egypt in cinema in the future as well, because we've had a few films that have dabbled in that area again and obviously wanted to open up the notion of the Egyptian epic and have failed. They've gone about it so the immediate film that springs to mind is, of course, Gods of Egypt, which I don't want to get into necessarily today, but I would like to discuss at some point. And that was a very notable failure in the popular realm and the critical realm. And we also had Ridley Scott's film about the Exodus as well.
Yeah.
Again, not very well received, wasn't hugely successful in financial terms, I don't think. And it seems to be that a lot of these attempts to touch on these points are failing. And I think it's probably going to see Egypt relegated to B-movie status again for a bit. That's just my steaming hot take on it.
No, I think that's true. I think Swords and Sandals epic were a big deal at one stage.
In the 50s.
But, yeah. But you had Troy. But there's always a long period of time between them, and Exodus being the last doesn't do so well. So they're not cheap movies. So if it doesn't do very well, it's not going to entice people to make another one.
Absolutely. And I think we'll see some very Egypt-shy studio executives for a little while at least, because it seems like the last few attempts at putting Egypt on the big screen haven't gone down terribly well, which is a damn shame, because I want to see more of this content. I want to see more of these movies. I literally just bought the DVD of the horror film Pyramid, which I'm going to watch at some point, and
I've seen that.
Possibly review or discuss with your good self if you're up for it at some point.
It's interesting because a lot of these are all based around that kind of ancient Egypt. It's mystical. We don't know what it is, kind of modern sensibilities from kind of Western world. And it'll be interesting to see. I appreciate that back in the 30s and into the 70s, there was this kind of, we didn't understand these things so well. Whereas now with the internet, there's no real excuse for that. So, which is a big part of why there are these issues in this mummy film. It doesn't take a huge amount to answer these questions, to make it historically accurate where it can be. So it'll be interesting to see if moving forward, we start to see more historically accurate or believable, relevant takes on kind of ancient Egypt, or, you know, I want to see an Egyptian mummy movie. There might actually be one. I don't know.
Chris, I've really enjoyed getting your filmmaker's perspective and horror filmmaker's perspective on this movie and these universes. You've certainly given me some perspectives I wouldn't have necessarily thought of, and some questions I wouldn't have thought to ask as well. So really appreciate that. Thanks for coming on today.
Not at all. Thank you very much. And for educating me in the ways of ancient Egypt.
Well, that is what I'm here for, apparently. Supposedly. I don't know.
I'm here, man. I'm tuning in.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, man. And I'll catch you on another one of these episodes soon.
Sounds good.
That's sadly all we have time for today, but be sure to check back in for new episodes which continue to explore manifestations of the ancient world in the modern, including interviews with a bevy of archaeologists and Egyptologists, cometics and reconstructionists, and key players in historical entertainment, including authors, filmmakers, actors, and game designers. If you like the show, please subscribe and rate it on your preferred platform, and tell all your friends. I've been Dr. Harrison, and this was the Profane Egyptologist podcast. Thanks for listening.